So today I want to talk about what is actually happening right now, not what the markets are pricing in, not what the press conferences are saying, what is structurally happening. Because the thing about ceasefires is that they have two completely separate realities. There is the reality that gets announced, and there is the reality that exists on the ground. And right now, in the early hours of Friday, April 10th, 2026, those two realities are not the same thing. On Tuesday night, less than 2 hours before his own deadline expired, Donald Trump posted on Truth Social that the United States and Iran had agreed to a 2-week ceasefire. Not a press conference, not a national address. Truth Social, he called it a total and complete victory. He said almost all points of contention had already been agreed to. Markets exploded. The Dow jumped 1,325 points in a single session. Oil dropped below $95 a barrel. Stock markets across Asia and Europe surged the following morning. Anchors smiled. Commentators celebrated. The word peace appeared on every front page. And then Iran published their official response. The Supreme National Security Council released a statement that should have been the headline on every network in the world. This is what they wrote. This does not signify the termination of the war. Our hands remain upon the trigger, and should the slightest error be committed by the enemy, it shall be met with full force. Read that again. Read it slowly. Our hands remain upon the trigger. That is not the language of a country that accepted defeat. That is not even the language of a country that accepted a ceasefire. That is the language of a country that paused, locked, and loaded, and is now watching to see what happens next. Trump called it total victory. Iran called it a pause with weapons still loaded. Both statements were released within hours of each other. One of them is describing a different event than the other. And understanding which one maps to reality is the only thing that actually matters right now. Because the Islamabad talks begin today, and what happens in that room over the next 48 hours will determine whether this 2-week window becomes a path to settlement or becomes the opening period of a second phase of this war. So let me walk you through what I believe is actually happening, not what is being said, what the structure of the situation forces each player to do. Because once you understand the structure, the ceasefire does not look like victory. It looks like a mechanism that both sides entered with completely different assumptions about what it means. Now let me first explain how we got here, because context is everything, and most of the coverage is treating this ceasefire like it arrived from nowhere. It did not arrive from nowhere. It is the product of 40 days of warfare that followed a specific sequence. And that sequence tells you exactly where the pressure is coming from and who is actually holding leverage right now. On February 28, 2026, while indirect nuclear talks were still active, while Omani mediators were telling the International Crisis Group that a peace deal was within reach, Israel and the United States launched Operation Epic Fury. The opening strikes did not target a nuclear facility. They targeted Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei directly, killing him along with his daughter, his son-in-law, and his grandchildren. On the same morning, 40 senior Iranian commanders and officials were eliminated simultaneously. The defense minister, the IRGC chief, the naval commander, the intelligence minister, gone in a single morning. The International Crisis Group's Ali Vaez later described Khamenei as the most pragmatic decision-maker in the Iranian system, adding that his assassination potentially closes the door on nuclear diplomacy and empowers less predictable hardliners. The Omani mediators confirmed that a deal had been within reach. The strikes happened anyway. 8 days after Khamenei's death, Iran's assembly of experts named Mojtaba Khamenei as the new supreme leader. He is 56 years old. He is the son of the man America and Israel just killed. The IRGC pledged full obedience and self-sacrifice, vowing to fight until Iran achieved victory. Trump responded publicly. He told ABC News directly that Mojtaba was unacceptable and would need American approval to remain in power. Iran selected him anyway. Now here is what that sequence tells you. It tells you that at the very moment negotiations had momentum, military action replaced them. It tells you that Iran's new supreme leader is a man whose father was assassinated by the countries now sitting across the table in Islamabad. And it tells you that the IRGC, the military force that actually controls Iran's missile systems and drone networks, made a public pledge of total war to that man 3 weeks before this ceasefire was announced. That is the foundation the Islamabad talks are sitting on. That is the structural reality underneath the market optimism. Now let me talk about what each player actually wants, because this is where the situation becomes very difficult to resolve and very easy to misread. What does America say it wants? It says it wants peace. It says the ceasefire is a total victory. It says almost all points have already been agreed to. What does America actually need from this? America needs the Strait of Hormuz open. Not partially, not conditionally, open. Because as of this morning, as of right now, the strait is still not functioning normally. Lloyd's List, which tracks live maritime intelligence, confirmed that only 3 vessels transited the waterway in the first 24 hours after the ceasefire was announced. South Korea has 26 ships currently unable to move through. South Korea just announced it is sending a special diplomatic envoy to Tehran specifically to negotiate safe passage for its vessels. Think about what that means. One of America's closest Pacific allies is conducting its own separate negotiations with Iran over a waterway that Trump announced was open as part of a victory he declared. The strait is not open, and Trump has now added a new complication, warning Iran against charging tolls to tankers, which is something Iran floated as part of its Hormuz control framework. Even Abu Dhabi's oil chief said the strait is simply not open. America also needs this ceasefire to hold long enough to produce a deal before the 2 weeks expires on April 22nd. Because if it collapses, the military pressure Trump threatened, hitting every bridge, every power plant, a whole civilization dying, that threat now has a credibility problem. Iran saw Trump move that deadline more than once. Iran watched him announce a ceasefire 2 hours before his own ultimatum expired. The perception being calculated in Tehran is that the urgency of reaching a deal came from Washington, not from Iran. Moshe Citrinovich, an analyst tracking the negotiations, noted publicly that the push for talks originated in Washington, that the Trump administration shaped, if not dictated, the ceasefire proposal through Pakistan. That does not mean Iran lacks interest in a deal, but it tells you who was feeling the clock more acutely. Now, what does Iran actually want? Iran wants what it published. All 10 points. And this is where the gap between the two sides becomes enormous. Iran's 10-point plan is not a compromise framework. It is a complete restructuring of the regional order. Point 1, a formal American commitment to non-aggression, not a pause, a binding guarantee. Point 2, full withdrawal of all U.S. combat forces from the Middle East. Approximately 50,000 American troops are currently deployed across Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, and Qatar. Iran wants them gone. Point 3, and this is the one that breaks every previous negotiation, acceptance of Iran's right to enrich uranium. Not a cap on enrichment, not limits. Recognition of the right itself. Point 4 and 5, lifting of all primary and secondary sanctions against Iran. Every sanctions the U.S. has been building for 40 years. Point 6 and 7, termination of all UN Security Council resolutions and all IAEA resolutions targeting Iran. Point 8, full war reparations paid to Iran. Point 9, cessation of all combat on all fronts, explicitly naming Lebanon and Hezbollah. And point 10, any deal must be formalized in a binding UN Security Council resolution, making it permanent and irreversible under international law. Now, here is the critical thing you need to understand about that list. Trump's red line, the position his press secretary stated explicitly this week, is that there will be no uranium enrichment in Iran. No enrichment. Trump posted it himself on Truth Social. He said the United States will, working with Iran, dig up and remove all of the deeply buried nuclear dust. Iran's 10-point plan, specifically in the Farsi version released to Iranian state media, demands acceptance of enrichment as a sovereign right. So the American red line and Iran's opening demand are the same issue, pointing in exactly opposite directions. And it gets more complicated than that. There are now officially 2 different versions of Iran's 10-point plan in circulation. The English language version shared with international media omits the enrichment demand. The Farsi version circulated inside Iran includes it. Vice President Vance dismissed the public English version as coming from a random Yahoo in Iran, submitting it to public access television. Trump posted that the 10 points Iran published were different from the 10 points given to the US, and that the real points would be discussed behind closed doors. Iran's parliament speaker Ghalibaf responded by saying that 3 points of the framework had already been violated before the talks even began. He said a bilateral ceasefire or negotiations under these conditions was unreasonable. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi posted on X that the ball is in the US court and the world is watching. So you have two versions of the document on the table. You have a US red line that contradicts Iran's foundational demand. You have Iran's parliament speaker calling the ceasefire already violated. And you have the Islamabad talks beginning today with all of this unresolved. Now let me explain the Lebanon problem, because Lebanon is not a side issue in these negotiations. It is the issue that could collapse the entire framework before a permanent deal is reached. Here is the structural problem. Pakistan, the mediator, announced publicly that the ceasefire included Lebanon. Iran insisted it included Lebanon. Iran's 10-point plan explicitly names Lebanon and Hezbollah as covered fronts. Trump and Netanyahu both said it does not include Lebanon. And on the morning of April 8th, hours after the ceasefire was supposed to be in effect, Israel launched what its own military described as its largest attacks on Beirut since the war began, striking 100 Hezbollah targets in 10 minutes during rush hour, killing more than 250 people. Lebanon declared a national day of mourning. Hundreds more were wounded. Iran immediately paused Hormuz tanker traffic in response. Iran's IRGC warned of a regretful response. Iran's ambassador to Pakistan briefly posted on X that the ceasefire was collapsing before deleting the post. The White House denied the strait had been closed. Lloyd's List confirmed that virtually no additional vessels were moving through. Trita Parsi, the executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, put it directly. It is going to be very difficult for the Iranians to agree to a ceasefire on their own for themselves while leaving Lebanon exposed. He called the Lebanon question a major test of what the United States is actually able to deliver. Because here is the structural problem America faces. Netanyahu has publicly said there is no ceasefire in Lebanon. Netanyahu is not under American diplomatic control in the way that fiction would suggest. Lebanon says it will not negotiate while under fire. A Lebanese official told CNN directly there will be no negotiations under fire. So, the ceasefire mediator says Lebanon is included, the US says it is not. Israel says it is not. Iran says it must be. Lebanon says it cannot negotiate under bombardment. And Israel struck Lebanon harder on day one of the ceasefire than on any other single day in the conflict. This is not a procedural disagreement about treaty language. This is a structural incompatibility between what the US needs to deliver to Iran to keep the talks alive and what Israel is willing to stop doing. Now let me talk about the Islamabad talks themselves, because who is in the room matters enormously. The US delegation is led by Vice President J.D. Vance. With him are Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Iranian state media reports the Iranian delegation is led by Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf, a former IRGC commander, alongside Foreign Minister Araghchi. This is the highest-level direct meeting between the United States and Iran since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. That fact alone tells you something. It tells you the situation is serious enough that both sides agreed to a level of direct engagement neither has permitted in 47 years. Iranian officials are specifically said to prefer Vance over Witkoff and Kushner, viewing Vance as more cautious about prolonged military involvement and more open to ending the conflict. Vance has been described as a potential 2028 Republican presidential candidate who has positioned himself as resistant to extended Middle Eastern military commitments. But here is something that does not get mentioned enough. The last round of ceasefire negotiations in the final 8 hours before the deal was reached, according to sources speaking to The National, was completed after Iran asked Kushner and Witkoff to leave the room because of their perceived pro-Israel stance. The ceasefire was then secured. Now Kushner and Witkoff are back at the Islamabad table, and it is unclear whether any IRGC representative will be present in the Iranian delegation. The IRGC is the institution that controls Iran's military posture. It is the institution that made the public pledge of full war. Ghalibaf is a former IRGC commander, but that is not the same as having the current IRGC leadership in the room. A deal that does not have IRGC buy-in does not hold. That is not an opinion. That is a structural observation about how Iranian military decision-making works. Now, let me give you the 3 specific things I am watching in the next 14 days that will tell you whether this is a real settlement process or a pause before phase 2. The first thing I am watching is what happens with the enrichment question in the first session today. Trump has said publicly, in writing, no enrichment. Iran has said in Farsi to its own population, enrichment is a right. These 2 positions cannot both survive in the same deal. Something has to give or collapse. If the first day of talks ends without either side explicitly softening this position, the framework is not functional. Watch whether Vance offers any language on enrichment that is ambiguous enough for Iran to interpret as partial recognition without Trump calling it capitulation. That diplomatic ambiguity is the only mathematical solution to this gap. If it does not appear in the first session, the gap stays unbridgeable. The second thing I am watching is Hormuz traffic. The ceasefire was supposed to produce full reopening immediately. As of Thursday morning, oil was still trading at $98 and change. Not 70, not 80, 98. Iranian officials said vessels could transit if they coordinated with Iran's armed forces. Trump has warned that charging tolls is unacceptable. Iran's 10-point plan calls for continued Iranian control over Hormuz. That means Iran is entering permanent negotiations on the premise that it controls a waterway that 20% of the world's oil passes through. And the U.S. position is that control of that waterway is not available for negotiation. Watch whether actual tanker traffic normalizes in the first week. Not press releases about traffic, actual vessel movements tracked by Lloyd's List and maritime data providers. If the numbers do not recover meaningfully by the end of next week, the economic pressure that created the ceasefire in the first place has not been resolved. It has only been paused. The third thing I am watching is whether the Lebanon front holds or breaks the framework. Netanyahu said this week that Israel wants direct negotiations with Lebanon over disarming Hezbollah and establishing peaceful relations. Lebanon said it will not negotiate while under fire. King's College analyst Andreas Krieg stated publicly that the greatest threat to any ceasefire in the region remains Israel, which prefers ambiguous ceasefire deals that allow it to continue specific operations. If Israel strikes Lebanon again at significant scale before April 22nd, Iran's parliamentary speaker has already telegraphed the response. He said a bilateral ceasefire or negotiations is unreasonable under those conditions. He said 3 clauses were already violated on day 1. A second major Israeli strike in Lebanon during the 2-week window has a realistic chance of ending the ceasefire. And if the ceasefire ends, the next military phase does not start where the last one ended. It starts with both sides escalated, with Iran's new Supreme Leader politically committed to a harder line, and with the IRGC's pledge of full war already on record. Now let me zoom out, because there is something in the economic data that has not received enough attention, and that will be the long-term consequence of these 40 days, regardless of what Islamabad produces. JP Morgan's economists this week described what they see as a regime change in energy market risk perception. Not the specific price of oil right now, the baseline level of risk that markets will permanently price into Middle Eastern energy supply. Before February 28th, the Strait of Hormuz was treated as functionally guaranteed safe passage, an implicit assumption that no actor would actually close it because the consequences would be too severe. That assumption has now been tested. Iran closed it for 5 weeks. Ships stopped moving. Oil hit $126. The IEA called it the greatest global energy security challenge in history. Even if the Islamabad talks produce a permanent deal, the market now knows the closure can happen. It has happened. And anything that can happen once will be priced as able to happen again. TD Bank strategists wrote this week that the market rally from the ceasefire announcement reflects a reduction in tail risks, not a material improvement in the underlying outlook. Economist Justin Wolfers was more direct. The economy does not just snap back. The Economist Intelligence Unit's Pratibha Thakur described the arrangement as a pause in the conflict rather than any kind of lasting resolution. She called it very fragile. That assessment came on the same morning markets were celebrating. The European Council, in a statement endorsed by the leaders of France, Germany, Italy, the United Kingdom, Japan, Australia, Canada, and 17 other countries, said explicitly that the goal must now be to negotiate a swift and lasting end to the war within the coming days. They called it a starting point, not a solution. They called on all sides to implement the ceasefire, including in Lebanon. The next day, Israel struck Beirut. None of those 17 governments could prevent that. There is one more structural constraint on these negotiations that almost no one is discussing, and it is possibly the most important one. Iran's new Supreme Leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, is 56 years old. He was elevated 8 days after his father was killed by the countries now sitting across from him in Islamabad. His domestic political legitimacy is built on the narrative of resistance and survival. Any deal he signs must be sellable to the Iranian public not as capitulation, but as the terms of victorious Iran extracted from a war it fought and did not lose. Iran's Supreme National Security Council said publicly after the ceasefire that nearly all the objectives of the war have been achieved. Good news to the dear nation of Iran. That is the narrative Mojtaba Khamenei needs to sustain. He cannot sign a deal that contradicts it. He cannot accept zero enrichment, full U.S. military presence, and no reparations and survive politically. His entire legitimacy is the legacy of resistance to the demands America and Israel made on February 28th. A deal that looks like everything America demanded on February 28th is a deal he cannot make. And here is what makes this structurally tragic. America's opening position, Trump's red lines as stated this week, is very close to everything America demanded on February 28th. No enrichment, U.S. troops staying, no compensation framework, and Israel continuing operations in Lebanon. The JCPOA, the 2015 nuclear deal that was actually implemented, was far more limited than what Iran is now demanding, and far more limited than what America is now asking for in a different direction. Iran's 10-point plan is not a nuclear deal. An analyst cited by Middle East Eye put it precisely. This is a comprehensive restructuring of the regional order in Iran's favor. That is what Iran walked into Islamabad asking for. America walked in asking for the opposite restructuring. The 2-week clock expires on April 22nd. J.D. Vance arrives in Islamabad this morning as I'm recording this. The talks begin today. And the ceasefire that is supposedly in effect has already produced 250 dead in Lebanon, drone strikes on Abu Dhabi's Habshan gas complex, a direct hit on a Saudi pipeline, 28 Iranian drone attacks on Kuwait, 35 on the UAE, 7 confirmed interceptions by Qatar, and continued control of the Strait of Hormuz by Iranian coordinated forces. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth confirmed this week that all U.S. troops remain in place. 2 aircraft carrier strike groups, nearly 20 warships, more than a dozen air squadrons. He said specifically, and these were his exact words, "We stand ready to restart at a moment's notice." The American military apparatus that fought this war for 40 days is still deployed. It is not moved. It is waiting. So the question is not whether this ceasefire ended the war. Iran's own statement answered that. The question is whether the Islamabad talks can find language on enrichment, on Lebanon, on Hormuz, and on the withdrawal of U.S. forces that both sides can describe as acceptable to their own domestic audiences. That is an almost impossibly narrow diplomatic corridor. Vance called this ceasefire a fragile truce and said it had taught him a lot about Iran. He was right that it is fragile. He is about to find out exactly how much he learned. Watch what comes out of Islamabad today. Watch what Iran's delegation says publicly after the first session. Watch whether Lebanon is addressed or deferred. Watch whether the Strait of Hormuz data, the actual ship movements tracked by independent maritime services, shows normalization or continued restriction. And watch what Mojtaba Khamenei says publicly in the coming days. Because a supreme leader who was elevated on a pledge of full resistance, whose father's death is the founding moment of his political authority, needs to return from these negotiations with something that looks like victory. What Trump needs to bring home looks like victory, too. And in this particular negotiation, it is very hard to see how both of those things can be the same deal. The guns are quiet this morning. Islamabad is waiting. The clock is running. And Iran already told you in writing in the official statement they released accepting the ceasefire that their hands are still on the trigger. Take them at their word.